The morning she came up our road with that trailer, it was a Tuesday in late October of 2019, and the sky was the color of a tin can left in the weather, that flat, oyster gray that means the first hard frost is maybe 4 days out, and the ground knows it even if the calendar hasn't caught up yet. I was out along my south fence checking a corner post that had been leaning since the wet spring, and I heard her coming before I saw her, the way you hear everything on a road like ours, that particular low complaint of a loaded trailer on gravel, and I straightened up and watched her go past. She was driving a dark green pickup, not new, not clean, pulling a flatbed stacked with what I could see from 40 yards were fence posts and rolled wire and a come-along and a few things covered under a gray tarp tied down with yellow rope. She did not slow down when she passed me, and I did not wave, because on this road you do not wave at someone until you know whether they are coming to stay or just to look, and by then you know the difference. She turned in at the end of my south field, where the county road bends east and drops toward the gorge, and she went through the gate of the Alderholt place, and the dust came up behind her, and the frost-bitten grass on either side of the track lay flat and gray, and I stood there at my fence post for a long moment before I went back to work. I want to be honest about my reasons for remembering that morning so clearly. It was not because I suspected then what she would eventually find. It was because every serious rancher on this bench had looked at the Alderholt place in the last 15 years and walked away from it, and I had been one of them, and watching a person drive through that gate with fence posts and wire and a come-along, someone who had not walked away, made me feel something I did not immediately have a name for. Part respect and part guilt, and part the particular kind of curiosity that lives only a fence line away from jealousy, if I am being fully honest with you, and I try to be. The Alderholt property was 112 acres of what had once been productive bench ground along the east rim of the Cavender Gorge, about 9 miles south of town, and by 2019 it had been sitting in an estate for 11 years since Rupert Alderholt's widow passed, and before that it had been leased out in a kind of tired, half-hearted rotation to 2 or 3 different outfits that never stayed more than a season because the ground on the bench was dry and thin over hardpan in the upper third, and the lower 40 acres dropped sharply toward the gorge rim and had been unstable since the slide of 1941, when a section of the east wall came down and buried the lower field improvements and rerouted the seasonal draw that had once watered the whole place. The slide was not a secret. It was in the county records. The agricultural extension had assessed the lower bench in 1987 and again in 2004, and both times the recommendation was the same: fence it off, do not cultivate, do not build, monitor the rim for further movement. The 2004 report, which I had read because I was one of the people who had looked at the place, put the acreage of compromised ground at 44 acres, which was not a small number when the total was only 112. You could run some cattle on the upper bench in a good year, maybe carry 22, 23 cow-calf pairs if the grass came in, but in a dry year you'd be hauling hay by August, and the water situation was poor because the slide had disrupted the original spring development, and what remained was a single stock tank, fed by a buried line from a cistern that the extension man, a fellow named Gerald Pratt, who I had no quarrel with personally, told me in 2014 was undersized and likely compromised. He had said it the way those men say things, politely and certainly and with a clipboard, and I had believed him because I had no particular reason not to, and I had driven away from the Alderholt place that fall without making an offer, and I had more or less put it out of my mind, the way you put away a thing you have decided against. The estate had eventually priced it at $430,000, which was not unreasonable for 112 acres on a county road with a structurally sound house and a decent equipment shed, if the ground had been what the upper bench suggested it was. But the lower bench discount was real, and the water situation was real, and 2 serious buyers had come and gone in the year before she appeared, and the asking price had come down to $318,000 by October of 2019. And even at that number, the phone was not ringing. She had paid $304,000 for it. I learned that from the county assessor's office about 3 weeks after she moved in, the way you learn most things out here, which is to say, not from the person herself, but from the public record and the diner in town, both of which move information at roughly the same speed and with roughly the same amount of invention added to the original facts. By noon on the day the deed transferred, the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown, and she had become in that version either a retired veterinarian from the coast who had sold a house for an unreasonable sum and was buying a retirement view, or a woman with some kind of trust fund and no practical sense, depending on who was doing the telling. I did not know which version was closer to true, and I did not go out of my way to find out, because it was not my ground and not my business, and I had enough of my own to attend to. My name is Earl Beckett. I am 68 years old. I have run cattle on the bench ground north of the Alderholt place for 31 years, and my father ran it before me for 22 years before that, and his father had a lease on pieces of this country going back to the late 1940s, which is not ancient history, but is long enough that we have watched a number of people come through here with plans, and we have watched what happened to most of those plans, and we have learned, the three of us across those years, to move slowly and pay attention and not to confuse wanting something to be true with evidence that it is. Her name was Nora Vasquez Holt. I did not learn her full name until about 2 weeks after she arrived, when she came up my road on foot one afternoon, which was itself an unusual thing, because people out here do not generally walk to a neighbor's place if they have a working truck, and the fact that she walked told me she wanted to talk and not just to arrive. She was somewhere in her middle 50s. I would put her at 54 or 55 at that first meeting, though I never asked. And she was built the way people are built who have done physical work for a long time, not large but set, the way a good fence post is set, with the sense that she was not going anywhere unless she decided to. She had dark hair cut short, and she was wearing canvas work pants and boots that had been resoled at least once, and a canvas chore coat that had seen 3 or 4 seasons of real work in it, not the kind you buy at a feed store for the look of it, but the kind that has feed dust and wire oil and one small burn mark on the left cuff from some job she had done close to a heat source. She came up to where I was working on a gate hinge in my east lot, and she said, "Good afternoon," and I said the same, and she said her name and where she was, and I said I knew where she was, and I told her my name, and she nodded once, as if she had already known that too, which she probably had, because the road runs both ways, and the diner moves information the same direction for everyone. She said she wanted to ask me about the draw on the lower bench of the Alderholt place, specifically about where the seasonal water came from before the slide, and whether I had ever seen the draw running in a wet year. I told her I had seen it run twice in 31 years, both times after wet winters, and that before the slide it had reportedly been a more reliable source, a spring-fed draw that ran most of the year in good conditions, but that the slide had rerouted it underground or buried the source entirely, and nobody had gone looking for it seriously because the lower bench was unstable, and the extension office had recommended against disturbance. She listened to all of that without interrupting, which I appreciated, and then she was quiet for a moment, looking out past my east lot toward the south end of my ground, and she said, more to herself than to me it seemed, that the water had to be going somewhere. And then she thanked me and walked back down my road the way she had come, and I watched her go, and I went back to my gate hinge, and I remember thinking that she was either very smart or very stubborn, or possibly both, and that those two things in the right proportion are not the worst combination in a person trying to work difficult ground. She had not told me why she bought the place. I had not asked. That is the way we conduct ourselves out here on First Conversations. And you learn more by waiting than by asking too early, because a person will tell you what they want you to know at the pace they want to tell it. And if you push ahead of that pace, you only get the surface of the thing and not the depth of it. What I learned over the following weeks and then months, in the incremental way you learn things about a neighbor who is private but not unfriendly, was this. Nora Vasquez Holt had spent 26 years as a range and riparian consultant for a firm that did restoration work on degraded agricultural properties across the inland West. She had a degree in soil science and hydrology from a state university, and she had spent more than 2 decades reading damaged land and finding what was still worth recovering in it and what was genuinely gone, which is a different set of skills than ranching, but not an unrelated one. She had grown up on a small dryland operation 2 states east of here, her mother's family's place, and she had left it young to go to school and then to work, and had spent her career helping other people's land. And she had decided in the year she turned 53 that she wanted to do it for herself, on her own ground. She had looked at 31 properties in 14 months before she made an offer on the Alderholt place. 31 properties. She had a notebook in which she had recorded observations on each one, a small black-covered field notebook, not the ancestral ledger kind I will tell you about in a moment, but her own working document. And she had a system of notation she had developed over 26 years of professional assessment, and what her notation said about the Alderholt place, after 2 site visits and a review of every county record she could obtain, was that the lower bench was not the liability it appeared to be, or rather that its liability was being calculated wrong, because everybody who had assessed it was assessing the risk of the slide without adequately accounting for what the slide might have done to the hydrology underneath it, and that the spring source that fed the original draw had not necessarily been destroyed by the slide, but might have been redirected, and that a redirected spring source was a very different problem from a destroyed one. And the difference between those 2 things was potentially the difference between a property worth $304,000 and a property worth considerably more. She had not told the estate that. She had not told Gerald Pratt. She had made her offer and signed her papers and come up the road with her fence posts and her wire and her come-along, and she had started working her ground. I will tell you that when I eventually understood the full shape of what she had reasoned out before she ever bought that place, I felt 2 things simultaneously. One was a genuine and uncomplicated admiration, the kind you feel when you see someone do a thing with precision and preparation and quiet nerve. The other was the cold, specific memory of the afternoon in 2014 when I had stood in that same lower bench and listened to Gerald Pratt tell me the water situation was poor and likely compromised, and I had nodded and driven away, and I had believed the word compromised when I should have asked what precisely was compromised, and in what direction, and whether that was permanent. My father had a saying about that. He said, "A man who stops at the word problem has decided he doesn't want a solution." I had stopped at the word compromised, and she had not. Now I have to tell you about a different notebook, because this is the part of the story that changes the weight of everything that came before it. Nora Vasquez Holt did not find what she found purely on her own reasoning, though her reasoning was sound and would likely have gotten her to the same place eventually. She was helped in the way that the living are sometimes helped by the dead, if they are paying attention, by something left behind on that property, by Rupert Alderholt's father, a man named Clarence Alderholt, who had originally filed on that bench ground in 1931, and who had lived on it and worked it until 1968, when he passed the operation to Rupert, and who had died in 1974. Clarence Alderholt had kept records, not the careful ledger book kind that some of the old German and Scandinavian settlers kept, with columns and dates and everything ruled out in ink. Clarence kept what I can only describe as a working man's notebook, which is to say a thing that was not meant to be read by anyone except himself, a spiral-bound 5x7 that he had used to write down observations about the ground the way a doctor writes notes in a chart, terse and technical and abbreviated, and not always grammatically complete, because it was not a document for posterity, but a tool for memory, a place to put the things he had noticed so he would not have to hold them all in his head at once. There were 4 of these notebooks. Rupert Alderholt had kept them in a tin box in the back of a shelf in the equipment shed, not because he valued them particularly, as far as anyone could tell, but because throwing away a dead father's handwriting is a thing that most people are not able to bring themselves to do, even if the handwriting is mostly about drainage grades and grass counts and the moisture content of a particular patch of soil in a particular season 40 years ago. Nora found the tin box on her second day on the property when she was inventorying the equipment shed. She brought the box to the house and sat with it that evening and read all 4 notebooks in one sitting, by the light of a work lamp she had set up on the kitchen table, because the overhead fixture in the kitchen needed a new ballast, and she had not yet gotten to it. She told me this later, much later, when we had become the kind of neighbors who talk plainly across a fence about what things actually cost and what they were actually worth. And she described reading those notebooks the way you describe reading something that rearranges the furniture in a room you thought you knew, not dramatically, not with a single revelation, but steadily, page by page, the way a good grade of ground reveals itself under a probe, layer by layer, each one telling you something the layer above it had not. 3 of the 4 notebooks were what you would expect: grass observations, water tank notes, cattle counts, weather records, the occasional complaint about a piece of equipment, the kind of record that a working man keeps for the working man's reason of needing to know what happened last time. But in the 4th notebook, the one that covered roughly 1938 through 1943, there was a section about the slide. Clarence had been on that bench when it happened. He had been 31 years old in the spring of 1941 when the east wall of the gorge came down, and he had written about it in his terse, abbreviated way, not with drama, but with the careful noting of a man who is watching something happen to his land and wants to record it accurately, because he will need to understand it later. He had written about where the slide originated and how far the debris had traveled, and what had been buried and what had been exposed. And at the bottom of a page about the rerouting of the seasonal draw, in handwriting that was slightly smaller and more careful than the surrounding text, as if he had been thinking slowly while he wrote it, there was a line that Nora had read 3 times before she went on to the next page. The line read, "Spring box not in debris field. Checked twice. Come back to this." And below it, underlined once with a pencil line gone faint, but still legible after 76 years, water still moving under East Bench. Going somewhere. Clarence Alderholt had written those words in the summer of 1941 and had apparently never come back to them, or if he had not written down what he found. And the spring box and the water moving under the East Bench had stayed in that notebook, in that tin box on that shelf in that equipment shed, for 78 years, waiting for someone to read them carefully enough to understand what they meant. Nora Vasquez Holt understood what they meant. She had spent 26 years reading damaged land, and she knew what a buried spring source that was still active looked like in the soil profile, and in the vegetation pattern, and in the moisture readings of the surrounding ground. And she spent the first 3 weeks of November 2019 doing what she called a systematic surface assessment of the lower bench, which meant walking a grid she had laid out with flagging tape in 100-foot intervals, and taking moisture readings with a probe at each intersection and recording the vegetation at each point, and noting any anomalies in the microtopography, the small humps and depressions that a slide-affected bench will develop over 80 years as the debris settles unevenly and the water below it finds its paths. She walked that grid every other day for 3 weeks. She was out there in the frost before 7 in the morning, and she was still out there at 4 in the afternoon when the light went flat and cold, and she walked it in straight lines with her probe and her notebook and her flagging tape. And she did not hurry it because she knew that you cannot hurry a systematic assessment and get a reliable result, that the reliability is entirely a product of the method, and the method requires the patience to cover every point, even the ones that look like they are going to tell you nothing, because the one that tells you something is often adjacent to the one that looks like nothing. She found 3 anomalies. The first was a section of bench about 80 feet north of the old debris field margin, where the soil moisture readings were consistently higher than the surrounding ground in a pattern that was not explained by surface drainage, not the right grade for it, not the right aspect for retained precipitation. The second was a cluster of late-season vegetation, mostly sedge and a particular grass she identified as a species that prefers wet-foot conditions, growing in a rough oval about 40 feet across in an area of the lower bench where there was no surface water source to explain it. The third was a slight but consistent depression in the microtopography running from the northwest corner of that wet-foot oval southward toward the gorge rim, a depression of no more than 8 or 10 inches at its deepest point, the kind of thing you would step across without noticing if you were walking that ground for any other purpose, but that to a person who had laid a 100-foot grid and was measuring everything, it said something about the direction that water was moving below the surface, and the direction it said was not toward the buried spring source that Clarence had noted, but away from it, which meant the source was up gradient, which meant it was still there, which meant it was still working, which meant that what the slide had done was not destroy the spring, but bury its outlet, and that for 80 years that water had been moving under the east bench, looking for a place to go, and finding the gorge rim and going over it in a seep that nobody had thought to trace back, because nobody had had a reason to trace it, and nobody had been standing on that bench with a 100-foot grid and Clarence Alderholt's 4th notebook in their memory. That is what she found in 3 weeks in November. Not the spring box itself, not yet, but the shape of where the spring box had to be, the way you find a thing in the dark not by looking directly at it, but by reading everything around it until the center is the only place left that you have not accounted for. She told me later that when she had assembled the 3 anomalies on her grid map and drawn the lines connecting them to the debris field margin and to the gorge rim seep that she had located on the 3rd week, and when she had traced those lines back to their logical origin, the origin fell on a point in the upper edge of the slide debris field that was approximately 140 feet from where the original spring box had been marked on the 1931 filing plat. Not at the plat location, 140 feet north of it. Because the slide had come from the north and the debris had traveled southward, and the spring box had been hit by the leading edge of the debris and pushed or rolled 140 feet from its original position before being buried under 4 to 6 feet of slide material, and in 80 years of extension assessments and drainage consultations and estate reviews, nobody had gone out to the leading edge of the debris field with a probe and a grid, and Clarence Alderholt's 4th notebook, and looked for it there. She had put the notebook down on the kitchen table that November evening after she had drawn the lines, and she had sat there for a long moment in the light of her work lamp, and she told me she had thought about Clarence Alderholt, a man she had never met, who had been 31 years old and watching his lower field disappear under the east wall of the gorge, and who had walked out onto the debris afterward and noted in his careful small handwriting that the spring box was not in the debris field and that water was still moving under the east bench, and who had written "come back to this" and had never come back to it, whether because the work of keeping a ranch running in the 1940s did not allow for it, or because the extension office told him the lower bench was unstable, and he believed them, or because he simply ran out of time, the way people run out of time, with the thing they meant to do still waiting on the list. He had left the note anyway. He had written it down anyway, in his small, careful hand, on the chance that someone would need it later. The land doesn't care who does the work, she told me once. It just keeps the account until someone shows up to settle it. She did not dig in December. I want to be clear about that, and I want to be honest about why I mention it, because it matters to the shape of the story. The ground on the lower bench was frozen by the second week of December 2019. And even if it had not been frozen, digging into a slide debris field without knowing exactly what you are digging into and where the load-bearing mass lies is the kind of thing that will get a person hurt, or get a person's equipment stuck in a way that is expensive and embarrassing, and sometimes both. And she knew that, and she did not dig. She spent December and January doing what she described to me as the homework phase, which meant pulling every document she could get her hands on related to the original spring development, the 1931 filing, the county road survey from 1934 that had a hand-drawn topographic of the bench, a 1939 water rights assessment that had been filed as part of a grazing dispute and which contained a surveyor's note about the spring's location and estimated output, and a 1952 county agricultural inventory that had been compiled by a man named D.W. Fassbinder, and which contained, in its entry for the Alderholt bench, the observation that the pre-slide spring had been assessed in 1938 at an output of approximately 4.5 gallons per minute, which is not a large number in absolute terms, but is a significant number for a spring-fed stock water system on a bench this size, enough to run a cistern and a stock tank and have water left over in all but the driest years, which is the difference between a place that is marginal and a place that works. She also, in January, had a conversation with a man named Tom Sveska, who was at that time in his mid-70s and had worked on a road crew in this county in the early 1960s, and who had, in 1963, been part of a crew that had done some grading work on the county road near the Gorge approach, and who remembered being told by one of the older crew members to stay well back from the east bench edge because there was a buried spring development in the slide area that had never been properly capped and that the ground above it could be soft. Tom Svestka was the kind of man who remembers specific things from 60 years ago with a clarity that younger men do not manage for last Tuesday. And he told Nora what he remembered, and she wrote it down. And what it added to everything else she had assembled was a confirmation that in 1963, 22 years after the slide, the spring was still understood by people working that ground to be present and uncapped under the debris field, and that its precise location was known to have been on the east side of the debris mass, not the center and not the south edge, which was consistent with her grid anomalies and with Clarence Alderholt's note about the spring box being north of the center debris field, and also consistent with the 140-foot offset she had calculated from the filing plat. She had not yet put a probe in the ground at the target point. She had done every piece of the homework first. That is a discipline I recognize because my father had it too, this insistence on knowing the shape of the thing before you touch the thing, on reading every available document and walking every available surface before you commit the ground to a decision, because a decision made in the ground is expensive to reverse and sometimes impossible. My father would say, measure everything twice and dig once. She had been measuring since November. She had not yet dug. She dug in the second week of March 2020, which was a difficult time to be starting a significant ground project for reasons that had nothing to do with the ground, but she was already committed by then in every sense of the word, and she was not the kind of person who stopped a plan because the world outside the fence was uncertain. She hired a man named Del Rafferty, who runs an excavation outfit out of the small town 9 miles north of here, and who has been running it for 30 years, and who has a particular reputation for careful work in unstable or sensitive ground. The kind of digging that requires reading the machine's resistance as you go, rather than just pushing to depth and seeing what happens. She gave Del the grid map and the target point and the depth estimate she had calculated from her surface readings and from the 1939 Water Rights Survey's notes on the spring box construction, which had described the box as being set at approximately 5 feet below original grade with a 2-foot gravel cap, which meant that the top of the box, if it was at the target location and if it had not been significantly disturbed by the slide impact, would be somewhere between 6 and 8 feet below the current debris surface, accounting for the debris depth she had estimated from the microtopographic depression data. Dell had looked at her map and her notes and her calculations for about 10 minutes, sitting in his truck with the window down and the late winter air coming in cold and thin. And then he had said, without looking up from the papers, that if she was right about the depth, she had better have a plan for the water once they opened it up, because a spring that has been pressurized under 6 feet of debris for 80 years was going to move when it got daylight, and it was going to move with some enthusiasm. She had a plan. She had a 4-inch perforated pipe and a collection box and a gravity line already laid out and costed, and she told him so, and he nodded once and said, "All right then," and rolled up the window and drove away to get his machine. The excavation took 1 day. Dell worked from the grid coordinates Nora had given him, and he worked slowly and carefully, reading the machine's feedback the way you read a pulse, taking material in shallow passes, and pausing every 18 inches or so to let the walls settle and to probe the floor of the excavation by hand, because a hand can feel things a machine cannot. The change in resistance, that means you are entering saturated material. The slight giving, that means the substrate below, is not what the substrate above was. He found saturated material at 4 feet and 8 inches below the debris surface, a full foot above Nora's minimum depth estimate, which meant the spring box was set shallower than the 1939 survey notes had suggested, or that the debris had settled somewhat over 80 years and compressed the overburden, or both. At 5 feet and 3 inches, at approximately 2 in the afternoon on a cold, clear Wednesday in March, Dell's careful probing found the top of the gravel cap. He cleared the cap by hand with a flat spade, going down through 18 inches of clean gravel that someone had placed there with care in the early 1930s when Clarence Alderholt, or possibly his own father, had built this thing. And at 5 feet and 9 inches below the debris surface, the flat spade hit wood. The spring box was intact. Not perfectly intact. One corner of the lid had been cracked by the slide impact and had admitted some debris over 80 years. But the box itself, which was built from 2-inch thick fir boards that someone had mortared at the joints with a lime compound, was structurally sound, and when Dell cleared the debris from the crack in the lid and lifted the lid panel, the water that came up into the excavation was clear and cold and moving. And it had been moving in that box in the dark under 6 feet of debris since 1941, waiting for someone to come and open the lid. Nora told me later that she did not say anything when the water came up. She said Dell said, "Well," and then neither of them said anything for a while, and that the sound of the water in that excavation on that cold March afternoon was a complete sound, the kind of sound that does not need commentary. I believe her. Some discoveries arrive with the right kind of silence, and the silence says what words would only approximate. She put her hand in the water. She said it was 44 degrees, and that it ran clear over her fingers, and that there was no taste of iron or sulfur, which meant it was a clean surface to groundwater source, a good spring, the kind that can be developed for stock water and potentially for domestic use with the right treatment, and that its output, when she measured it 2 days later with a portable flow meter, was 3¼ gallons per minute. Not the 4½ gallons the 1938 assessment had recorded, but 80 years of compressed overburden will reduce a spring surface output by restricting the discharge pathway. And once she had the collection box installed and the gravity line running and the debris cleared from the immediate area of the box, the output over the following 3 weeks climbed to 4 gallons per minute, and then to 4¼ and then stabilized in late April at approximately 4½ gallons per minute, within ¼ gallon of the 1938 measurement, as if the spring had simply been waiting to be given its proper room again and had returned to itself the moment it had it. The man who confirmed what she had was a soil and water consultant named Ray Esterhuisen, who had been working in this region for 32 years and who had a reputation for honesty that occasionally cost him clients, because honest assessments of damaged ground are not always what the person commissioning the assessment wants to hear. Nora had called him in May of 2020, 2 months after the excavation, once the spring had stabilized and she had a full set of flow measurements and water quality tests, and had completed the collection and gravity line installation, and had begun to see what the restored water access was doing to the lower bench in terms of soil moisture and vegetation response. Ray Esterhuisen drove out on a Tuesday morning in late May when the bench grass was coming in green, and the gorge below was full of morning shadow, and the air had that particular quality it gets on a good spring morning out here, washed and cool and carrying the smell of wet soil and new growth that is not quite like any other smell in the world if you have known it since childhood. He walked the lower bench with Nora for about 2 hours. He looked at the spring box installation, and the collection box, and the gravity line, and the outlet tank. He looked at her grid maps and her flow data and her water quality results. He looked at the vegetation response in the wet-foot oval, which by late May had expanded noticeably as the surface moisture regime around the recovered spring outlet changed. He probed the soil at 6 points in the lower bench and looked at what came up on the probe, and he stood there looking at it for a while. Then he walked the full perimeter of the lower bench, the part that the 2004 extension assessment had designated as compromised and not to be cultivated, 44 acres of it, and he walked it slowly, and he was quiet while he walked it. He pulled up grass at 4 points and looked at the root structure and the soil attached to the roots. He found a section of the lower bench, about 18 acres in the southeast corner, below the slide debris field's southern margin, where the slide had deposited material from the upper gorge wall that was not the hard pan and thin topsoil of the bench itself, but was a darker, heavier material, the kind of material that comes from a different geological layer than the surface bench soils. And he probed that section separately and looked at what the probe brought up, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said the word I had been told he sometimes said when he found something that surprised him, which was simply, "Huh?" spoken in a way that is not casual, but is the opposite of casual, the sound a careful man makes when the evidence in front of him is asking him to revise a calculation. He took several samples from the dark section of the lower bench, bagged and labeled them in the careful way of a man who has been doing this for 32 years, and he drove away without saying much more. The laboratory results came back in 3 weeks. The dark material in the southeast section of the lower bench was not ordinary slide debris. It was a deposit of what the laboratory analysis described as lacustrine organic sediment, lake bottom material from a geological period predating any human occupation of this region, deposited in the gorge basin when the gorge had been a lake rather than a drainage channel, and subsequently exposed and eroded from the gorge wall by centuries of water action, and then carried on to the lower bench by the 1941 slide, where it had been sitting for 80 years as an unlabeled liability, assessed as unstable slide debris, fenced off and left alone. The organic matter content of that sediment was measured at 11.4%. For reference, prime agricultural ground in this region runs between 4 and 6% organic matter. 11.4% is exceptional. That was the word Ray Esterhuisen used when he called Nora with the results. He said, "The organic matter content in the southeast section is exceptional." And then he said the number. And then he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I don't know what it was doing on top of the gorge wall to begin with, but it came down onto your bench and it's been sitting there for 80 years and nobody measured it." And then he said, "The 18 acres of it that I sampled are as productive a base as I've encountered in this region without the benefit of a machine." Nora told me Ray Esterhuisen was not a man who used the word exceptional casually, that in 32 years of practice he used it for things that genuinely warranted it and not for things that merely satisfied, and that hearing him say it about her lower bench, about the 44 acres that had been fenced off and written down as a liability in every assessment for 30 years was a particular kind of feeling that she did not immediately have a name for. I told her I thought the name for it was validation, and she thought about it for a moment and said, yes, but it was also grief, a little, for Clarence Alderholt, who had known the water was still there and had not come back to it, and who had farmed that bench for 40 years after the slide, without knowing that the slide had brought him something in exchange for what it had taken, that what he had fenced off and written down as a loss had been slowly revealing itself as something else entirely, and he had never known it. That is a hard thing to sit with. The land keeps its accounts and does not always tell you the balance while you are still alive to spend it. I want to tell you what the property is worth now, because this story is not only about hydrology and soil science and an old man's notebook, it is also about what happens when you look at a piece of ground carefully enough and long enough to see what it actually is, rather than what the last several assessments decided it was. In the fall of 2021, Nora had the property formally reassessed for insurance and financing purposes because she was planning to develop the recovered spring into a full water system serving both the upper and lower bench, and to begin bringing the exceptional southeast section into limited production, starting with a managed cover crop rotation to stabilize and build the profile before any more intensive use. The formal assessment valued the property at $680,000. She had paid $304,000 for it in October of 2019. The difference between those two numbers is $376,000, and it represents in its most reduced form the value of three things: Clarence Alderholt's fourth notebook and his habit of writing down what he noticed even when he could not immediately act on it, Nora Vasquez Holt's 26 years of professional practice in reading damaged ground, and her discipline in not touching the ground until she understood it, and the simple fact that the 1941 slide, which had been recorded in every county document for 80 years as a pure liability, a loss, a reason to fence off 44 acres and walk away, had in fact been two things simultaneously: a disaster for the spring outlet and an accidental gift of 18 acres of exceptional organic sediment from the bottom of a lake that had not been a lake for 10,000 years. The dismissive neighbor in the story, if I am being honest, was partly me, because I had been one of the people who looked at the Alderholt place in 2014 and walked away from it. And I had walked away because I had trusted Gerald Pratt's clipboard more than I had trusted the questions I had not thought to ask, and because I did not have Nora Vasquez Holt's 26 years of reading damaged land to tell me that the word compromised is a conclusion and not an explanation, and that the difference between those two things is worth finding out. I told Nora this one afternoon in the fall of 2021, standing at the fence line between her north boundary and my south field, watching her bench grass come in below us in the low October light, and she was quiet for a moment, in the way she is quiet when she is considering whether to say a thing plainly or not, and then she said, "You might have found it, Earl. You had the same ground to walk." I told her I had not had the notebook. She said, "You would have looked for the notebook." I am not certain she was right about that, but I am grateful she said it, because it was generous, and it was probably truer than the more comfortable version where I tell myself I simply lack the information and leave it at that. My father used to say that the ground will tell you what it is if you are willing to ask it more than once. I asked it once in 2014, and I accepted the first answer. She asked it every day from October of 2019 forward, and she kept asking it until it told her the whole truth, and the whole truth was considerably more interesting than the first answer had been. There is a lesson in that for any of us who have walked away from a thing because the first assessment said it was not worth the trouble. The assessment is only as good as the questions behind it, and the questions are only as good as the patience of the person asking them, and patience is the one thing that cannot be borrowed or bought or downloaded from an extension office report. It has to be built over time, the way good ground is built, slowly and without shortcuts, one season at a time, with attention and without hurry. That lower bench at the Alderholt place, at Nora Vasquez Holt's place now, is one of the better arguments I have seen in 31 years of watching this country for the proposition that the land holds more than it shows you at first, and that the gap between what it shows and what it holds is exactly the width of a person's willingness to keep asking. If you have got a piece of ground like that, or an old notebook in a tin box, or a spring you were told was gone and are not entirely certain is gone, I would like to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me what the first assessment said, and tell me what you found when you kept asking. And if this kind of story means something to you, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there, and there is more ground left to cover.